On my 23rd birthday, my parents took me to an expensive dinner to slide a legal waiver across the table. My mother smiled her most venomous smile and told me I was adopted, my foster stipends had expired, and I was officially cut from the inheritance. My father demanded I pack my bags tonight to fund my sister's lavish wedding. I did not cry. I signed the paper and said I found my biological family 5 months ago. They were sitting exactly 2 tables behind us. When my father turned around, his smug expression melted into absolute terror. My name is Rebecca, and I am 33 years old. I work as a financial forensics investigator, tracking down hidden assets and corporate fraud. But 10 years ago, I was just a girl surviving a family that saw me as a paycheck. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who completely underestimated your worth. The air inside Le Petit Chateau smelled of expensive truffles. It was supposedly a celebration for my 23rd birthday. Patricia, the woman I called mother my entire life, sat across from me. Next to her was William, my adoptive father, checking his gold watch as if my presence was costing him billable hours. My adoptive sister Brittany was taking selfies with her new engagement ring, ensuring the lighting caught the diamond perfectly. Her fiancé Terrence, a flashy tech startup founder, sat beside her looking completely bored. Without waiting for the appetizers, Patricia reached into her handbag and pulled out legal documents. She slid them across the white tablecloth into my water glass. "Sign the asset waiver," Rebecca Patricia said, her tone as casual as if asking me to pass the salt. "The state stipend for your foster care ended years ago. You are adopted, and you are officially cut out of the will. Brittany's wedding to Terrence needs funding, and you are just dead weight to this family." I stared at the papers. The legal jargon declared that I surrendered all rights to the family estate. For 23 years, I endured their emotional neglect, wondering why I was treated like a second-class citizen. While Brittany received European vacations, I was handed chore lists and hand-me-down clothes. Now the brutal truth was out in the open. I was an investment that stopped paying dividends. Brittany did not even look up from her phone. "Mom is right, Rebecca. Terrence and I are planning a destination wedding, and we need the extra capital. It is not like you need an inheritance anyway. You can keep living in that tiny apartment and doing whatever it is you do." Terrence scoffed, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. "You chose to go to community college. You have to live with the consequences of not hustling. Look at me, I built my tech company from the ground up as a proud black man in Silicon Valley. You just do not have the drive, Rebecca." I looked at Terrence, knowing William had bankrolled his entire operation. Before I could speak, William slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "We clothed you, fed you, and tolerated your community college finance degree," William sneered. "You should be on your knees thanking us for keeping you out of the system. I spent the last 23 years draining your state funds to pay for Brittany's private school and buy her that brand new BMW. Now that you are done with school, your usefulness expired. Pack your bags tonight and get out of our house. We need your basement room for Terrence's wedding gifts." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, beg for their love, or scream about the injustice of it all. Patricia had her napkin ready to dab her eyes and play the victimized mother for the restaurant staff. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out my favorite pen, and flipped to the last page of the waiver. "You mean the 15-year-old rust bucket I paid for entirely with my waitress tips, while you bought Brittany a luxury sedan?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I signed my name on the dotted line with a smooth, practiced stroke. I pushed the documents back across the table. Patricia looked momentarily confused by my lack of hysterics. She snatched the papers back, checking the signature to ensure I had not forged a fake name. "You are making this very easy," Patricia muttered, narrowing her eyes. "Good. At least you finally learned your place." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. "I did learn my place, Patricia. But you see, I did not just get a basic finance degree. I specialize in forensic accounting. I know how to track money. I know how to find hidden trails. And I started digging into my own background 5 months ago. William crossed his arms. What are you talking about? I smiled. I am talking about the fact that I found my biological family. I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly who has been funding you. Funny enough, they are sitting 2 tables behind you right now. William froze. The color drained from Patricia's face. Brittany finally put her phone down. William slowly turned around in his chair. 2 tables away, a woman and a man stood up. The woman was Catherine, a legendary East Coast billionaire and venture capitalist known for her ruthless business acquisitions. Beside her stood Nathaniel, my biological brother, and a highly feared federal prosecutor. Catherine's eyes were locked dead onto William. The cold fury radiating from her gaze was enough to freeze the dining room. William's smug confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. William stared at the woman standing 2 tables away. His face lost all color, shifting from a flushed red to an ashen gray in a matter of seconds. He knew exactly who Catherine was. Anyone in the financial sector knew Catherine. She was a self-made billionaire, a ruthless venture capitalist who dismantled failing corporations for sport. And right beside her stood Nathaniel, my biological brother, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed federal authority. Patricia, completely oblivious to the massive shift in power plastered on her most sickeningly sweet smile. She stood up, smoothing her expensive designer dress, and attempted immediate damage control. "Oh, you must be the biological relatives," Patricia chirped, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We were just having a family discussion. We love Rebecca dearly. We were simply testing her independence. You know how young adults need a firm push to stand on their own 2 feet?" Catherine did not even blink. She did not acknowledge Patricia's existence. Her sharp, calculating gaze remained fixed solely on William. She stepped forward with the grace of a predator closing in on its prey. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a thick manila envelope. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped it directly onto William's plate, knocking over his crystal wine glass. The red liquid bled across the pristine white tablecloth. "That is a formal audit notice," Catherine said, her voice slicing through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a scalpel. "I have spent the last 5 months buying out the debt of your mediocre logistics company. You owe me $4 million payable immediately." William gaped like a fish out of water. $4 million? You cannot do that. We have repayment structures. We have secured vendor agreements. Nathaniel stepped forward, pulling his federal badge from his jacket pocket and letting it flash under the chandelier light. "Your vendor agreements are void, William. I had my forensic team look at your books. You have been commingling corporate funds with personal accounts to pay for your daughter's lavish lifestyle. If you do not settle the debt with Vanguard Partners by Monday morning, I will personally see to it that the IRS opens a criminal investigation for tax fraud." Brittany finally dropped her phone. She stared at the spilled wine and the heavy envelope, her jaw slack. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly very interested in the restaurant exit. He was a man who smelled sinking ships, and William's ship was currently plummeting to the ocean floor. Patricia's fake motherly facade shattered completely, her face contorted into a mask of pure rage. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me. "You ungrateful brat!" she screamed, ignoring the shocked stares of every other patron in the dining room. "This is how you repay us. We took you in, we fed you, we bought you your first car." I stood up from my chair, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. I looked down at the woman who had made my childhood a miserable exercise in servitude. "You mean the 15-year-old rust bucket I paid for entirely with my own waitress tips?" I asked, my voice ringing clear and steady. "The car you forced me to buy while you bought Brittany a brand new BMW just because she managed to scrape a passing grade in high school biology. You never gave me a single dime. Patricia, you kept the state foster checks for yourself and used me as a live-in maid." "You are a liar!" Brittany shrieked, clutching her diamond engagement ring as if I were about to steal it. "You are just jealous because Terrence is a successful CEO and you are a nobody." "Enjoy the wedding, Brittany," I said smoothly, "if you can still afford it." I turned away from the table, leaving the signed asset waiver sitting in the puddle of spilled wine. Catherine smiled warmly at me for the first time that evening. She linked her arm through mine. Nathaniel took a protective stance on my other side. Together, we walked out of the French restaurant, our heads held high. I did not look back. I did not need to. I could hear William yelling at Patricia, the sounds of a toxic empire beginning to crumble under the weight of its own greed. 10 years passed. The terrified, insecure 23-year-old girl left behind in that restaurant was gone forever. I was 33 now, and I had built a reputation that made corporate criminals sweat. I was a lead financial forensics investigator working closely with federal agencies to dismantle fraudulent startups, track embezzled funds, and expose white-collar crime. I had my own firm in a sleek glass high-rise in San Francisco. My days were spent unraveling complex financial webs and taking down arrogant executives who thought they were above the law. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the delivery arrived. I was sitting at my mahogany desk analyzing a set of offshore bank statements when my assistant walked in carrying a heavy black envelope sealed with gold wax. "This just arrived via private courier," my assistant said, placing it on my desk. "It requires your direct signature." I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a piece of thick cardstock with raised gold lettering. It was an exclusive invitation to a highly publicized Silicon Valley gala. The event was a celebration for a massive new funding round a tech mixer designed to attract the wealthiest investors on the West Coast. My eyes locked onto the host's name printed boldly at the top of the card. Hosted by Terrence Miller, CEO of Apex Innovations. I leaned back in my leather chair and smiled. 10 years had passed, and Terrence had apparently managed to stay afloat playing the role of the flashy tech genius. I knew exactly who he was. I knew his startup was a massive house of cards. The Securities and Exchange Commission had quietly hired my firm 2 weeks ago to look into his sudden influx of foreign capital. Terrence had no idea that the federal government was already tightening a noose around his entire operation. He also had no idea that the investigator leading the charge was the adopted sister-in-law he had mercilessly mocked a decade ago. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Nathaniel. "Did you get the invitation?" my brother asked, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "I just opened it," I replied, running my thumb over the gold-embossed lettering. "Terrence is throwing himself a victory party for securing $20 million in seed money. The SEC wants to move in," Nathaniel said. "We have enough evidence of wire fraud to freeze his accounts, but we need to verify the source of the secondary funds he transferred last week." "Are you going to the gala?" I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. I looked out over the sprawling city, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt. Terrence and Brittany thought they had won. They thought they had buried me and moved on to a life of untouchable luxury. "Oh, I am absolutely going," I told Nathaniel. "Terrence invited the wealthiest players in the valley to show off his success. It is the perfect place to serve him reality." The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel hummed with the arrogant energy unique to Silicon Valley money. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and expensive designer gowns. Waiters in crisp white shirts glided effortlessly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. It was a massive monument to excess and corporate vanity. 10 years ago, walking into a room like this would have made me shrink into the shadows. I would have felt the crushing weight of Patricia and William whispering about my cheap clothes or my lack of proper breeding. Tonight, wearing a bespoke emerald green evening gown paid for entirely by my own financial success, I owned the floor. I took a tall glass of champagne from a passing tray and let my eyes sweep the massive room. I was looking for the host of this elaborate charade. It did not take long to find him holding court near the center stage. Terrence stood surrounded by a large group of older, wealthy men. He wore a custom velvet tuxedo jacket that screamed new money, complete with a heavy diamond-encrusted watch that caught the chandelier light every time he gestured. He was playing the part of the visionary tech founder to absolute perfection. His booming theatrical laugh echoed over the classical string quartet playing softly in the corner. I walked straight toward his exclusive circle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I stopped just at the edge of his group, waiting patiently for him to notice my presence. When he finally turned around, his performative smile vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. But Terrence was a street-smart hustler, masking himself as a corporate genius, and he recovered his composure quickly. He nudged the silver-haired investor standing next to him and pointed his crystal champagne flute directly at me. "Look who crawled out of the woodwork to join high society," Terrence announced loudly, making sure his entire circle of wealthy investors was paying attention. "If it is not my favorite outcast sister-in-law. Tell me, Rebecca, are you still crunching numbers in a sad little cubicle somewhere? I hear community college degrees do not get you very far in the real business world these days." The older men in the circle chuckled politely, sipping their expensive drinks and sizing me up. Terrence puffed out his chest, stepping away from his colleagues to loom over me, trying to use his height for intimidation. "You picked a hell of a night to crash my private party," Terrence continued, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "I just secured $20 million in seed funding for my new consumer app. We are going public by next year. I am building a global empire, and you are standing in my rented ballroom drinking my free champagne." Before I could formulate a response, a shrill, piercing voice cut through the sophisticated air of the gala. "Terrence, do not be mean to the poor girl." Brittany pushed her way aggressively through the crowd to stand right beside her husband. She wore a suffocatingly tight silver dress that looked entirely too restrictive. She immediately raised her left hand to brush a stray blonde hair from her face, deliberately flashing a massive, blinding diamond ring under the overhead lights. She looked me up and down from head to toe, her eyes narrowing with a very familiar toxic malice. She had not changed a single bit in the last decade. She still possessed the exact same entitled sneer she wore the night William and Patricia tried to throw me out on the street. "It takes a massive amount of nerve for you to show your face around us after what you did," Brittany said, crossing her arms defensively. "We should probably offer her a job, Terrence. Maybe as a front desk receptionist or a night janitor for your new corporate headquarters. Since she completely ruined Mom and Dad 10 years ago, she actually owes us big time. They had to downsize to a basic condo because of what your biological mother did to their logistics company. You should be on your knees begging us for a handout right now." The wealthy investors murmured amongst themselves, clearly intrigued by the bitter family drama unfolding right before their eyes. Terrence wrapped a protective arm around Brittany's waist, nodding his head in firm agreement with her insults. "She makes a very valid point," Terrence said, smirking down at me with absolute arrogance. "Send your basic resume to my personal assistant, Rebecca. I will see if we have an open spot in the mailroom for you. It is the absolute least I can do for my extended family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in anger or defend my career path. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat while they basked in their own manufactured arrogance. I looked at Brittany's flashy diamond ring, then at Terrence's custom velvet tuxedo, calculating exactly how many forged user metrics it took to purchase those items. I reached my free hand into my clutch purse and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. I held it out toward him, pinched casually between my index and middle finger. Terrence hesitated for a brief second before snatching the card aggressively from my hand. He looked down at it, clearly expecting to read the name of some low-tier accounting firm. I watched his eyes scan the embossed silver text. I watched his pupils dilate in sudden fear. I watched the smug, untouchable facade he had spent years building begin to crack right down the middle. "I am not looking for a job, Terrence," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom with absolute chilling authority. "I am the lead forensic investigator hired directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission." The group of investors standing around us suddenly went dead silent. The air in our small circle seemed to evaporate entirely. Brittany dropped her hand to her side, her eyes darting between my calm face and her husband in sudden sharp confusion. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the matte black business card in his hand like it was a live grenade ready to detonate. And that $20 million in seed funding you keep bragging about tonight. I continued taking one calculated step closer to him so he could see the absolute certainty burning in my eyes. It was just frozen by federal mandate exactly 1 hour ago. The silence in our small circle was absolute. Terrence stared at me, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged breaths as the reality of my words washed over him. The wealthy investors exchanged nervous glances, suddenly gripping their crystal champagne flutes a little tighter. No one in Silicon Valley wants to be standing next to a man when the federal government drops a guillotine on his neck. Terrence forced a laugh. It was a loud, booming, entirely artificial sound designed to reassure the billionaires backing away from him. He clapped his hands together, waving off my statement, as if it were a poorly timed joke. He turned to the silver-haired investor, clapping him on the shoulder, insisting it was just a bitter family dispute. But the investor simply stepped out of his reach, setting his glass on a passing waiter's tray and blending quickly into the surrounding crowd. Once the high-net-worth individuals were out of earshot, the fake smile melted off Terrence's face. He stepped into my personal space, his imposing frame blocking my view of the ballroom. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "You have no jurisdiction here, Rebecca." Terrence hissed, his breath hot against my cheek. "You are playing a dangerous game. My investors are solid. My legal team will have you stripped of your credentials by tomorrow morning for walking into my private event and making baseless accusations. You are just a bitter orphan trying to tear down a self-made man." I did not back away. I held my ground, looking directly into his panicked eyes. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a slim, encrypted tablet provided by my agency. I tapped the screen once, bringing up a dashboard of illuminated red graphs and highlighted transaction logs. "You have always been a master of creating illusions, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Just like when you faked your SAT scores in high school by paying that college kid to take the test for you. You have spent your entire life believing you are the smartest guy in the room while riding on the backs of other people. But the Securities and Exchange Commission does not grade on a curve." I turned the tablet around so he could see the screen. His eyes darted frantically across the brightly colored charts. "Your user metrics are completely fabricated," I continued, my voice echoing clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. "You told your investors that your new app had 2 million daily active users. You projected massive ad revenue based on those engagement numbers. But my forensic team spent the last 48 hours tearing apart your server logs. You used offshore bot farms to inflate your daily active users by 800%. Brittany scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her restrictive silver dress. She looked at the tablet, completely unable to comprehend the complex data spread across the screen. "You are just making things up to sound smart," Rebecca Brittany sneered. "Terrence is a visionary. TechCrunch just did a massive feature on his organic growth strategies. You are just jealous because he built a global brand while you are stuck working a miserable government job." I ignored my adoptive sister entirely, keeping my focus locked on the crumbling tech executive standing before me. "You rented thousands of virtual private networks out of Eastern Europe and India," I stated, listing off his crimes with clinical precision. "You programmed automated scripts to create fake accounts, simulate user engagement, and click on advertisements to generate fraudulent revenue streams. You lied on your quarterly disclosures. You committed wire fraud when you transferred those fake earnings into your primary operating account. The $20 million seed funding you secured was obtained through intentional malicious deception. That is a federal crime, Terrence." Terrence opened his mouth to defend himself, but before he could formulate another lie, a sudden commotion at the entrance of the ballroom caught my attention. Pushing aggressively through the elegant crowd were Patricia and William. My adoptive parents looked significantly different than the last time I had seen them at that French restaurant a decade ago. The stress of losing their precious logistics company to my biological mother had clearly taken a heavy toll. William's suit was tailored but outdated, hanging loosely on his tired frame. Patricia was desperately clinging to her former high society status, wearing a vintage designer gown that had clearly seen better days. They spotted us near the center stage and marched directly toward our circle. Patricia did not even bother greeting her golden child or her supposedly brilliant son-in-law. Her eyes locked onto me with an intense burning hatred. She shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking over a tray of expensive appetizers. "Stop ruining your sister's life!" Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the marble floors. "Have you not done enough damage to this family? You and your ruthless biological mother destroyed our legacy. We lost everything because of you." William stepped up beside his wife, pointing an angry finger at me. "We came here tonight to celebrate," Terrence William barked. "Terrence is a real businessman. He is bringing this family back to the top where we belong. You have absolutely no right to be here, Rebecca." Patricia grabbed Brittany's hand, pulling her golden child close as if I were a physical threat. She glared at me, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. "We had to mortgage our only remaining house just to give Terrence his seed money," Patricia yelled, airing their financial desperation to anyone within earshot. "We put our last shred of security on the line because of what your real mother did to us. We gave Terrence a $500,000 loan from our home equity because we believe in his genius. And now you show up here trying to poison his big night. You are a toxic, miserable girl." The music in the ballroom seemed to fade away entirely. The surrounding guests were now openly staring, watching the spectacular implosion of the once proud family. I looked at Patricia, then at William. They were completely blinded by their desperation to reclaim their lost wealth. They had placed all their remaining chips on a man who was nothing more than a highly articulate con artist. I lowered my tablet and looked at my adoptive parents with absolute cold pity. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment before I spoke. "You mortgaged your house?" I asked, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "That is strange." I reviewed the complete financial history of this startup. I traced every single dollar that went into the primary operating accounts over the last 2 years. I turned my gaze slowly back to my adoptive brother-in-law. The sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. "Terrence," I said smoothly, letting the question hang heavily in the air. "Did you tell my parents where their $500,000 actually went?" Terrence's eyes darted wildly before a feral growl ripped from his throat. He lunged forward, his heavy hands grasping for the encrypted tablet I held, desperate to smash the evidence into pieces. Before his fingers could even graze the device, a firm, immovable hand clamped down on his shoulder, shoving him backward with absolute authority. Nathaniel stepped smoothly out of the crowd, placing himself directly between me and my adoptive brother-in-law. Nathaniel did not raise his voice, but the cold steel in his tone commanded the immediate attention of the entire room. "Assaulting a federal investigator carries a mandatory minimum sentence," Terrence Nathaniel stated casually, letting his jacket fall open to reveal his federal badge. "I highly suggest you keep your hands strictly to yourself." Terrence stumbled back, his expensive velvet shoes slipping on the polished marble. He crashed into a cocktail table, sending a tray of champagne flutes shattering to the floor. William and Patricia gasped, physically recoiling at the sight of the federal badge. The surrounding tech investors, sensing the absolute ruin unfolding, pulled out their phones, recording the spectacular downfall of Silicon Valley's newest golden boy. I stepped around Nathaniel, keeping my posture relaxed and my gaze fixed on Terrence. I tapped a sequence on my tablet to access the gala's wireless audiovisual system. The massive projector screens flanking the main stage flickered. The looping, arrogant logo for Apex Innovations vanished entirely. In its place, a stark, high-resolution financial ledger illuminated the ballroom. I magnified a specific highlighted wire transfer so the numbers glowed brightly over the heads of the elite guests. "You told William and Patricia their home equity loan was going straight into server architecture and global marketing acquisition?" I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You stood in their cramped living room and sold them a dream about family legacy and guaranteed returns. You swore their final safety net was securing the infrastructure of your revolutionary application." William stared up at the massive screens, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His eyes traced the digital routing numbers, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "But you did not invest William's money into the app." I continued swiping my screen to reveal the next layer of the forensic trail. Red arrows traced the $500,000 through a complex web of shell companies. You wired their money to 3 separate offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, accounts directly linked to an illegal overseas syndicate. You used my parents' last remaining asset to cover your massive unpayable sports betting losses. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers. Investors who had been praising Terrence just 10 minutes ago were now frantically texting their legal teams to pull any association with him. William clutched his chest, leaning heavily against a marble pillar as the reality of his financial ruin finally sank in. He had traded his entire life's work for a scam artist's gambling debt. Patricia, entirely unable to process her own gullibility, completely snapped. She grabbed William by the arm and shook him. "Do not listen to her." "William," Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the high ceilings. "She is manipulating the data. She is using her government computers to frame Terrence because she has always been a bitter, jealous little brat. Terrence is a visionary. He is taking care of us." Brittany pushed past her mother, her face contorted into a mask of pure hysterical rage. She marched right up to the invisible boundary Nathaniel had drawn between us, clawing at her own throat. She grabbed a heavy, glittering pendant resting on her collarbone and thrust it forward like a shield. "Liar!" Brittany screamed, spit flying from her lips as she defended her cornered husband. "Terrence is a genius. You are just a pathetic orphan making up spreadsheets to ruin my life because no one ever loved you. Look at this. Look at what my husband gave me. He bought me this $50,000 necklace yesterday to celebrate the seed funding." A bankrupt man drowning in betting debt does not buy custom diamonds for his wife. I looked at the sparkling stone resting against Brittany's skin. It caught the chandelier light, beautifully projecting the perfect illusion of wealth and success. It was the exact type of shiny distraction Terrence had always used to manipulate the shallow women in my adoptive family. I tapped my tablet one more time. The offshore bank statements vanished from the main projector screens. A digitized receipt took their place, complete with a prominent jeweler's logo and Terrence's unmistakable digital signature at the bottom. I zoomed in heavily on the itemized description, highlighting the specific cut clarity and cost of the stone. "That necklace is cubic zirconia." "Brittany," I said, my voice slicing through her hysteria with brutal precision. "He bought it for exactly $500 in a discount strip mall jewelry shop." Brittany froze. Her fingers released the pendant, letting it drop against her chest like a heavy stone. She stared up at the massive screen, reading the word zirconia over and over again. Her entire identity, built entirely on superiority and material wealth, was dissolving in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in California. I let the $500 total burn into her brain before I swiped my screen one final time. A second receipt appeared beside the first. This one was from an exclusive high-end boutique in Beverly Hills, time stamped exactly 2 hours after the fake necklace was purchased. "The real question is," I said, my eyes locking onto Terrence as he desperately backed away toward the emergency exit, "who did he buy the real $50,000 diamond for?" The silence that followed my question did not last long. It was instantly replaced by a vicious, undeniable buzzing sound that swept through the St. Regis ballroom. Hundreds of Silicon Valley elites, venture capitalists, and tech journalists were now openly recording the spectacle on their smartphones. The flash of camera lights reflected off the polished marble floors, turning Terrence's private victory party into a public execution. Terrence stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a lie that could possibly explain away the 2 receipts glowing on the massive projector screens above us. He looked at Brittany, then at the crowd, his eyes darting frantically in search of an escape route. The answer to my question did not come from Terrence. It came from the edge of the VIP circle. The crowd parted slightly, making way for a stunning woman in a sleek crimson silk evening gown. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand and carried a silver clutch in the other. It was Jasmine. I recognized her immediately from my firm's background checks. She was officially listed as the Vice President of Marketing for Apex Innovations, drawing a massive salary from the company's rapidly depleting funds. But it was not her crimson dress or her executive title that drew every eye in the room. It was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. The flawless, brilliantly cut diamond caught the chandelier light, throwing prismatic sparks across the faces of the stunned guests. It was the exact necklace detailed on the Beverly Hills receipt displayed on the screen above us, the $50,000 diamond. Jasmine stepped directly into the center of our circle, her face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and boiling anger. She looked at Terrence, who visibly shrank backward, his custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Brittany's head snapped toward the new arrival. Her eyes locked onto the crimson dress, then slowly trailed upward to rest on the blinding diamond around Jasmine's neck. I watched the exact second the reality of the betrayal hit my adoptive sister. Her face contorted, twisting from smug arrogance into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She looked down at the dull $500 piece of cubic zirconia clutched in her own trembling hand, and then back at the woman wearing the real prize. "You gave my diamond to your marketing assistant," Brittany shrieked, her voice shattering the last remnants of civility in the ballroom. Brittany dropped her fake necklace onto the marble floor and lunged forward like a rabid animal. She threw herself at Jasmine, her hands hooked into claws, aiming directly for the younger woman's face. She grabbed a fistful of Jasmine's perfectly styled hair and yanked hard, screaming obscenities that echoed off the high ceilings. Jasmine shrieked in pain, dropping her champagne flute. The crystal shattered sharply against the floor, sending a spray of expensive alcohol over William's polished shoes. Jasmine did not back down. She swung her silver clutch, catching Brittany hard on the side of the cheek. Terrence panicked. He scrambled forward desperately, trying to separate the two women before hotel security could intervene and turn his federal wire fraud case into a local assault charge. He grabbed Brittany around the waist, pulling her backward with all his strength. "Stop it, Brittany, you are ruining the launch!" Terrence yelled, struggling to hold his thrashing wife. "Calm down. She does not mean anything to me. She's just a distraction. I swear to you, it was just a stupid mistake." Jasmine froze, her hand flying up to touch the heavy diamond around her neck. The sheer cowardice of Terrence's words hung in the air, broadcasting his pathetic infidelity to a room full of people holding recording devices. "A distraction," Jasmine yelled, her voice trembling with fury. "You told me you were serving her with divorce papers on Monday morning. You told me we were flying to Paris to celebrate the seed funding. You spineless, lying coward. You used my name to sign off on those offshore wire transfers." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps. Terrence had just been publicly outed as a fraud, an embezzler, and an adulterer, all in the span of 3 minutes. Investors were already backing away toward the coat check, desperate to scrub their names from the guest list. Nathaniel stood calmly beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the federal target thoroughly dismantle his own life. Patricia could no longer handle the absolute destruction of her social standing. Her entire identity relied on the projection of wealth and superiority, and both were currently bleeding out onto the floor of the St. Regis Hotel. She turned her back on her brawling daughter and her deceitful son-in-law. She marched directly up to me, her face purple with manic desperation. "You planned this!" Patricia screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger inches from my face. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle just to humiliate us. You have been waiting 10 years to ruin your sister's life. You are a demon, Rebecca. You are a malicious, ungrateful demon sent to destroy my family." I looked at Patricia with absolute, unwavering calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I did not force Terrence to steal $20 million from federal investors, Patricia A. replied smoothly. I did not force him to sleep with his vice president of marketing, and I certainly did not force him to gamble away your final safety net on offshore sports betting. I simply brought the receipts. You destroyed your own family the moment you tied your wagon to a criminal. Patricia raised her hand, her palm open, preparing to strike me across the face. Before her hand could even begin its descent, Nathaniel stepped forward. He caught her wrist mid-air, his grip like a steel vise. He did not say a word. He simply glared down at her, the federal badge gleaming on his chest, acting as an absolute barrier. Patricia whimpered, trying to pull her hand back, suddenly realizing she was attempting to assault a federal agent's sister in front of 100 witnesses. Jasmine, meanwhile, had reached her absolute breaking point. She shoved Terrence violently in the chest, pushing him away from her with disgust. She straightened her crimson dress, her chest heaving as she glared at the pathetic man she had helped commit federal fraud. Then her eyes shifted past Terrence. She locked her furious gaze directly onto Patricia, who was currently rubbing her wrist and trying to hide behind William. Jasmine was fully aware that the Securities and Exchange Commission was already analyzing the company's ledgers. She knew her name was on those documents. She knew she was going down, and she clearly refused to be the only one taking the fall. She marched right up to the invisible line separating my biological family from my adoptive one. "Do not stand there and play the Saint, Patricia!" Jasmine sneered, her voice carrying an entirely new level of venom. "You want to scream about Rebecca ruining your family. You want to cry about mortgaging your house to fund this pathetic startup. I managed the books for Apex Innovations. I processed every single incoming transfer. I know exactly where you got the collateral to secure that $500,000 loan." William's head snapped up, his eyes widened in absolute terror, his mouth dropping open as he looked at Jasmine. Patricia's face went chalk white. She took a stumbling step backward, grabbing William's arm for support, as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. Jasmine smiled a sharp, predatory smile. She looked around the room, making sure every single smartphone camera was focused squarely on Patricia's terrified face. "Should I tell the room about the offshore trust fund?" Patricia Jasmine asked, her voice echoing clearly over the stunned crowd. "Should I tell Rebecca exactly whose money you and William have been using to fund your lavish lifestyle for the last 10 years? William looked confused, his eyes darting frantically between Jasmine and the woman he had been married to for over 3 decades. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and frail under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. He turned to his wife, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and sudden, terrifying suspicion. "What trust fund?" William asked, his words echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "Patricia, what is she talking about? We mortgaged the house. We sat in the lawyer's office and signed the equity paperwork together. We agreed it was our last option to save the family." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She gripped the fabric of her vintage designer gown, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes wide with absolute panic, as the walls of her meticulously constructed reality began to close in on her. Jasmine let out a sharp, vindictive laugh. She smoothed the skirt of her crimson silk dress, clearly enjoying the absolute destruction of the woman who had likely looked down on her for years. She took a step toward William, wielding the truth like a deadly weapon. "You actually believe she mortgaged the house, William?" Jasmine sneered, her tone dripping with toxic amusement. "She did sign the preliminary papers with you. She put on a great show, but she never actually submitted those documents to the bank. A $500,000 equity loan requires weeks of underwriting appraisals and massive amounts of corporate red tape. Terrence needed that seed money in 48 hours to cover his bad bets with the syndicate." Patricia did not go to the bank, William. She went straight to her private offshore accounts. William staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He grabbed the edge of a nearby cocktail table to steady himself. "Private accounts. We share all our finances. We have shared everything since we lost the logistics company. We were bankrupt. You told me we were destitute. Patricia hired me 5 years ago to falsify tax documents," Jasmine announced to the entire room, turning her gaze to ensure every recording smartphone captured her confession. "I was a freelance accountant back then, long before I became your son-in-law's brilliant vice president of marketing. She has been receiving a massive secret pension from an unknown source and meticulously hiding it from you, William. She had me route the money through a dummy corporation in the Bahamas. Shell companies nested inside shell companies. She paid me a 20% cut just to keep my mouth shut and sign off on the fake federal tax returns." William stared at his wife in sheer horror. The realization of her ultimate betrayal washed over him in real time. "You hid a fortune!" William roared, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated rage. "While I sold off my father's antique watches to pay our legal fees, while we downsized to a miserable, cramped condo and ate generic food, you let me believe we had nothing. Patricia lunged forward, her hands outstretched in a desperate, pathetic plea. William, please, you have to listen to me. I was saving it for us. I was protecting our future. I knew we would need an emergency fund. Brittany stood frozen in her restrictive silver dress. Her entire world was incinerating before her eyes. Her husband had faked his corporate success and bought his mistress a $50,000 diamond, and now her mother was being exposed as a fraud and a master manipulator. The wealthy, untouchable facade of the family was gone forever. I watched the chaotic scene unfold with absolute chilling clarity. The final missing pieces of my federal investigation were suddenly snapping perfectly into place. When I traced the origins of Terrence's fraudulent seed money, I had hit a massive wall of offshore shell companies. I originally assumed Terrence had borrowed the capital from dangerous loan sharks to cover his gambling debts. I had never considered that the call was coming from inside the house. I stepped forward, my voice slicing effortlessly through the screaming match between William and Patricia. It was not an unknown source, I said. The entire ballroom went completely silent again. William, Patricia, Brittany, Terrence, and Jasmine all turned to look at me. Nathaniel stood right beside me, his hand resting casually near his federal badge, watching the criminals trap themselves in their own inescapable web of lies. I locked my eyes onto Patricia. I saw the absolute terror radiating from her pupils. She knew exactly what I was about to say. She knew the game was entirely over. I have spent the last 10 years tracking hidden assets. I continued, my voice, cold, calculated, and echoing with absolute authority. I know exactly how desperate people hide money. I know the tricks they use to bypass IRS audits, and I know my biological family's financial history. I pulled my encrypted tablet back up, tapping the screen to access the sealed federal files Nathaniel had provided me months ago. I projected the specific document onto the massive main screen behind the stage. It was a heavily redacted legal trust agreement stamped with an official date from 25 years ago. When my biological mother, Catherine, gave me up for adoption, my grandfather was furious. I stated, letting the heavy words sink into the quiet room. He refused to let his only granddaughter disappear into the foster system without a safety net. He set up an irrevocable trust fund. It was specifically designed to pay out a massive monthly stipend for my care, my education, and my eventual college tuition. William turned slowly to Patricia, his face twisting in pure disgust. You told me the state cut off her foster stipends when she turned 18. You told me we were paying for her community college out of our own pockets. She told you a lot of lies, William, I said, keeping my gaze pinned strictly to Patricia. She told me I was a severe financial burden. She told me I owed her for the cheap food I ate and the roof over my head. She used me as an unpaid maid while constantly complaining about the cost of my existence. Brittany's hands began to shake. My cars, my private school tuition, Brittany whispered, looking at her mother with wide, panicked eyes. You told me we were rich. You told me Rebecca was just a charity case. You were the charity case, Brittany, I replied smoothly, delivering the brutal truth. Everything you own, every advantage you ever had in your entire life was paid for by the grandfather you never met. You lived a life of luxury built entirely on stolen funds. I took one final deliberate step closer to the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Patricia was shaking violently, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. She looked around the ballroom searching for a friendly face, but found absolutely no one. The Silicon Valley elite were looking at her with pure revulsion. It was a trust fund established by my biological grandfather, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. A trust fund that you gained illegal access to when you adopted me. You never spent a single dime of that money on my well-being. You funneled it into offshore accounts to fund your pathetic illusion of wealth. Nathaniel pulled out his phone, holding it up for Patricia to see. Embezzlement of a minor's trust fund, massive tax evasion, and federal wire fraud, my brother listed casually. That carries a rather hefty federal prison sentence. I looked at the broken, miserable woman standing before me. Patricia, I asked, delivering the final crushing hook. How much exactly did you embezzle from the account that was legally meant for me? Patricia stared at me, the color entirely drained from her face. For a split second, the polished high society matriarch completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate thief. She hiked up the heavy fabric of her vintage designer gown and bolted. She shoved past Terence, ignoring the shattered crystal on the floor, and made a frantic dash toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom. Nathaniel did not even break a sweat. He simply took 2 long strides to his right, casually positioning his broad shoulders directly in front of the exit. Patricia crashed into him, bouncing off his solid frame like a bird hitting a window. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her elaborate updo unraveling as strands of hair fell across her panicked eyes. "You are not going anywhere, Patricia," Nathaniel said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "The exits are secured by federal agents. You are currently the primary target of an active federal investigation." I stepped closer, keeping the pressure fully applied. I tapped my tablet, replacing the trust fund charter with a cascading wall of bank statements and forged withdrawal slips. The red numbers illuminated the room, exposing a decade of systematic malicious theft. "You discovered the biological trust fund 15 years ago," I stated, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the silent ballroom. "When you realized my grandfather had bypassed you entirely and left the money in a restricted account, meant solely for my education and living expenses, you could not stand it. You could not stomach the idea that the orphan you despised was sitting on a mountain of generational wealth." I pointed to the massive screen above us, tracing the digital timeline of her crimes. The high-definition projection showed exactly how the money had been bled out. "You hired a shady notary and falsified my signature," I continued, presenting the forged documents for the entire Silicon Valley elite to see. "You claimed legal guardianship override. You set up a ghost account in the Cayman Islands and began slowly bleeding my trust dry. $50,000 here, $100,000 there. You funneled exactly $1.5 million out of my rightful inheritance and straight into your private reserves." The sheer magnitude of the theft sent a collective shockwave through the room. Investors and tech journalists murmured in disbelief. Stealing from an orphan was a new low even for the most ruthless corporate sharks in attendance. Flashbulbs went off as reporters captured the definitive proof glowing on the screen. I turned my gaze to William. The older man looked as though the ground beneath him had turned to liquid. His breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the red numbers on the screen. $1.5 million. He mouthed the words silently, his mind desperately trying to reconcile the staggering sum with the reality of his own miserable existence over the past decade. William slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The confusion in his eyes morphed into a dark, terrifying rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his outdated collar. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "You had $1.5 million. William roared, his voice cracking with the force of his anger. "You sat on a hidden fortune while I worked 80 hours a week at the logistics company trying to keep us afloat." Patricia shrank against the mahogany doors, her hands trembling as she tried to placate him. "William, please, you have to understand. I was securing our retirement. I was making sure we had a safety net after you lost the business to her biological mother." "Do not lie to me," William bellowed, taking a menacing step toward her. "You did not secure anything for us. You secured it for yourself and your precious golden child." He gestured violently toward Brittany, who was still standing in the center of the room, clutching her cheap cubic zirconia necklace, her face streaked with ruined mascara. "I liquidated my pension to pay for Brittany's private university tuition," William screamed, airing every painful financial sacrifice he had made. "I sold my father's vintage car collection just to afford her extravagant wedding to that fraud standing over there. I nearly worked myself into an early grave-skipping meals, taking out high-interest loans and humiliating myself in front of investors to keep this family from going bankrupt. My health deteriorated. I missed years of my life chained to a desk. And you had millions hidden away." Patricia tried to reach out to him, her voice a desperate whine. "I paid for things, William. I bought Brittany's cars. I paid for the country club memberships. I kept up our appearances so we would not become a laughingstock in this town." "You bought those things with stolen money," William spat back, his face twisted in absolute disgust. "You watched me suffer. You watched me break my back for this family and you let me do it. You let me believe we were destitute while you skimmed a fortune from a child's trust fund to buy designer handbags and luxury vacations. He looked at the woman he had been married to for over 3 decades, shaking his head slowly as if he were looking at a complete stranger. The betrayal ran deeper than just the money. It was the sheer lack of basic human decency. "I am done," William announced, his voice dropping to a cold, decisive tone that echoed across the quiet ballroom. "I am absolutely done. I want a divorce, Patricia. I will be filing the papers first thing tomorrow morning, and I will be handing over every single financial record I have to the federal investigators. I will not go to federal prison for your sick, greedy obsession with wealth." The word divorce hit Patricia like a physical blow. The last pillar of her carefully curated high society life had just been kicked out from under her. She had lost her money, her reputation, and now her marriage, all in front of the most powerful people in California. She was completely cornered, with no way out and nowhere left to hide. But Patricia was not the kind of woman to go down quietly. If she was sinking, she was going to drag everyone else down into the abyss with her. The panic in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, venomous fury. She stood up straight, smoothing the wrinkles from her ruined vintage gown, and glared at her husband with pure hatred. "You want to play the innocent victim, William?" Patricia shrieked, a manic, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "You want to stand there and pretend you are some noble martyr who sacrificed everything for this family?" She raised a shaking, manicured finger and pointed it directly at his chest, her eyes blazing with malice. "Do not act innocent." "William," Patricia yelled, her voice dripping with toxic vindictiveness, "you want to talk about stealing from a child? Let us talk about how she got into this family in the first place. You love playing the righteous patriarch now that the cameras are rolling." William froze. The self-righteous anger completely evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. He took a quick step backward, holding his hands up as if trying to physically block her words. "Patricia, shut up. Do not say another word." "Why not?" Patricia sneered, relishing the absolute panic in her husband's eyes. "You are so eager to hand over financial records to the federal agents. Let us give them the whole picture. Let us show them exactly what kind of man you really are." Patricia turned her venomous gaze back to me, a sick, triumphant smile twisting her lips. "Who do you think signed the forged adoption papers 30 years ago to get the initial payout?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying an absolute devastating finality. "He knew, Rebecca. He knew everything from day one." William stumbled back as if Patricia had plunged a physical blade into his chest. The self-righteous indignation that had fueled his entire rant simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His jaw worked silently. He looked at the hundreds of faces staring back at him, the flashing phone cameras capturing his absolute ruin. He tried to shake his head, tried to formulate a denial, but the truth was written clearly in the panicked sweat beading on his forehead. He had known. He had signed the documents. He had built his entire logistical empire on the stolen foundation of a 5-year-old orphan's inheritance. He had forced his adoptive daughter to live like a burden, to wear hand-me-downs, and endure his wife's constant emotional abuse, all while secretly funneling her birthright into his own corporate accounts. The sheer magnitude of his hypocrisy left the wealthy gala attendees in a state of stunned, breathless silence. Before William could utter a single pathetic excuse or attempt to shift the blame back onto Patricia, Nathaniel took complete control of the room. My brother reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out 2 thick legal envelopes. They were stark white and bore the unmistakable seal of the Department of Justice. He did not hand them over politely. He stepped directly into William's personal space and slapped the first envelope firmly against his chest, forcing the older man to grab it before it hit the floor. Nathaniel then pivoted and thrust the second envelope directly into Patricia's trembling hands. "You are both formally served," Nathaniel declared, his voice ringing with absolute clinical authority that echoed over the soft classical music still playing from the ceiling speakers. William and Patricia Wilson, you are hereby subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury. The charges include but are not limited to aggravated identity theft, masterminding a multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme, and felony wire fraud. Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but Nathaniel held up a hand, silencing her instantly. Your passports have already been flagged and frozen by the State Department, Nathaniel continued smoothly. If either of you attempts to leave the state of California, if you try to book a flight, or if you attempt to move a single cent from your remaining bank accounts, I will personally have you handcuffed and dragged out of your beds in the middle of the night. Do you understand? Patricia stared down at the envelope in her hands as if it were a live grenade. The heavy, expensive paper represented the end of her freedom, the end of her country club lunches, and the absolute destruction of the Wilson family name. She let out a low, guttural sob, finally realizing that no amount of manipulation or screaming could save her from federal prison. William simply stared blankly at the floor, a completely broken man. While the crowd was entirely captivated by the spectacular collapse of the Wilson patriarch and matriarch, my peripheral vision caught a sudden jerky movement near the back of the room. Terrence had used the explosive distraction of Patricia's confession to his advantage. He had quietly slipped away from Jasmine, completely abandoned his hysterical wife Brittany, and was currently attempting to dissolve into the shadows. He was inching along the velvet wallpaper, his eyes fixed desperately on the heavy brass handles of the kitchen service exit. He was mere feet away from slipping out the back door, escaping the flashing cameras, and vanishing into the San Francisco night before the federal agents could secure the perimeter. I did not even look up from my tablet as I spoke, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a whip. Leaving your own party so soon, Terrence, I called out, causing several dozen heads and smartphones to immediately snap in his direction. We have not even talked about your little side hustle yet. Terrence froze, his hand hovering just inches from the brass door handle. He realized he was surrounded. 2 uniformed hotel security guards had already moved to block the service hallway, and the sea of tech investors formed an impenetrable wall behind him. The suave, articulate tech visionary persona he had carefully crafted over the last 5 years instantly shattered. He spun around, and for the first time all night, I saw the real Terrence. His posture dropped, shifting into a defensive, aggressive stance. The polished Silicon Valley vocabulary vanished, replaced by a raw, feral desperation. The bespoke velvet suit suddenly looked absurd on a man who was reverting to his basic survival instincts. You cannot touch me! Terrence snarled, his voice guttural and laced with pure venom as he stepped away from the door. You think a few fake bank logs on a glowing screen are going to put me away? I grew up on the streets. I survived in neighborhoods you would not even dare drive through. I built this entire company from absolutely nothing while you were sitting safely behind a government desk. I know exactly how to cover my tracks. I know how to scrub a server clean. You are just a privileged adopted brat playing detective because you are jealous of real success. He beat his chest, pacing back and forth like a caged animal trying to intimidate its captor. He glared at Nathaniel, then at the crowd, pointing an accusing finger at the very investors he had been charming an hour ago. I have layers of encryption that your pathetic little agency could not crack in 100 years. Terrence bragged, spittle flying from his lips as he desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. I am always 5 steps ahead of people like you. You have absolutely nothing concrete on me. You are bluffing, Rebecca. You are a fraud trying to ruin my reputation. I let him rant. I let him air his pathetic bravado to the entire room, watching as he confidently dug his own grave deeper and deeper. I waited until the echoes of his aggressive shouting faded into the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. When he finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving and his eyes wild with adrenaline, I offered him a slow, chilling smile. Cover your tracks, I asked, letting the question hang in the air for a long, agonizing second. Then why did you try to sell my firm's proprietary data to a Chinese shell company last Tuesday? Terrence let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the high ceilings of the ballroom. It was a forced, desperate sound, completely lacking his usual smooth, carefully practiced charisma. He looked around at the circle of tech journalists, venture capitalists, and federal agents throwing his hands up in an exaggerated gesture of disbelief. He was trying to rally the room, trying to gaslight everyone into believing that the walls were not currently caving in around him. Proprietary data, a Chinese shell company. Terrence scoffed, shaking his head as if he were dealing with an unruly, imaginative child. You are completely out of your mind, Rebecca. This is pathetic even for you. You are so desperate to bring down my family that you are just making up wild conspiracy theories on the spot. Look at me. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. I hold lucrative government contracts. I do not need to sell anything to anyone, especially not to some fabricated shell company. You have absolutely zero proof of these ridiculous claims. You are bluffing and everyone in this room knows it. He adjusted his bespoke velvet lapels, trying to physically reconstruct his shattered authority. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating his odds. I am walking out that door, Terrence declared, glaring at the hotel security guards and the federal agents blocking his path. And if any of you try to stop me, my legal team will bury you, this hotel, and this entire federal agency in so many lawsuits you will never see daylight again. You have nothing on me. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice, nor did I engage in his frantic, pathetic shouting match. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Nathaniel a subtle single nod. Nathaniel did not say a word. He calmly pulled a small black encrypted remote from his pocket, aimed it at the central console of the ballroom's audiovisual system, and pressed a single button. The ballroom's high-end surround sound speakers, which had previously been playing a soothing classical symphony, suddenly crackled with a sharp burst of static. The abrasive noise sliced through the suffocating tension in the room. A second later, a crisp, undeniably clear audio recording began to broadcast. The superior acoustics of the ballroom amplified every single syllable, making it entirely impossible for anyone to ignore the damning evidence. The algorithm is fully compiled and ready for transfer. Terrence's voice echoed through the massive speakers. He sounded relaxed, arrogant, and undeniably guilty. My development team spent 4 brutal years perfecting the predictive modeling, but I hold the master encryption keys. I can bypass the internal security protocols without triggering a single red flag on the mainframe. Another voice, accented and strictly businesslike, responded over the recording. And the price remains 15 million transferred directly to the offshore account we previously discussed. 15 million, Terrence's recorded voice agreed cheerfully. And I want the funds routed through the Cyprus holding company before the end of the week. My idiot father-in-law is too busy sinking his own logistical ship to notice a slight data leak, and the corporate board trusts me implicitly. You get the proprietary source code, I get my massive payout, and absolutely nobody is the wiser. The recording cut off with a sharp, heavy click, plunging the ballroom back into a dead, horrifying silence. The tech investors who had just minutes ago been eager to shake Terrence's hand and fund his next venture now stared at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Corporate espionage was the ultimate unforgivable sin in Silicon Valley. Terrence had not just cheated on his wife or lied about his background. He had actively plotted to sell out his own developers and commit treasonous corporate theft. William, already broken by Patricia's betrayal, looked like he was going to vomit upon hearing his son-in-law openly mock his failing company. Terrence stood completely paralyzed in the center of the room. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw hung slack. He looked like a man who had confidently stepped off a cliff and finally looked down. He opened his mouth, perhaps to claim the audio was a sophisticated deepfake, perhaps to offer another pathetic, transparent excuse, but absolutely no words came out. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away. I locked my eyes onto his terrified, wide gaze, letting him feel the full, crushing weight of his monumental failure. I knew you were a rat the moment you married Brittany, I stated, my voice echoing with icy, calculated precision. You were too slick, too eager to access William's logistics networks, and far too interested in my firm's data architecture. You thought you were the smartest guy in the room. I knew you were looking for a shortcut to wealth because men like you never want to do the actual work. You just want to steal the credit and cash the check. I gestured toward Nathaniel, who was watching Terrence with the predatory stillness of a federal agent ready to strike. So I set up a honeypot, I explained smoothly, pulling back the curtain on the trap I had spent months meticulously crafting. I created a dummy server filled with useless, heavily tracked code and left a digital breadcrumb trail right to it. I watched your server logs. I saw you poking around the restricted files at 2 in the morning. I knew your overwhelming greed would not let you ignore the bait. That Chinese buyer you met with at the Harbor restaurant last Tuesday, he was not a foreign corporate spy, Terrence. He was Agent Chen, an undercover federal operative working directly with my firm and the FBI. Terrence staggered backward, his knees practically buckling under the weight of the revelation. He grabbed the edge of a catering cart just to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. You walked right into a federal sting operation. I delivered the final devastating blow. You did not just violate your corporate non-disclosure agreements. You just committed corporate espionage and federal wire fraud on tape. The brutal reality of the situation crashed through the room. Terrence was not just facing a ruined reputation, corporate blacklisting, or a messy divorce. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Jasmine stood frozen a few feet away, her crimson silk dress suddenly looking entirely out of place in a room that had just transformed into an active federal crime scene. She had been reveling in Patricia's destruction, thoroughly enjoying her own elevated status as the victorious, untouchable mistress. But as the words corporate espionage and federal sting operation echoed in the air, a profound primal panic washed over her features. Jasmine was not just Terrence's mistress. She was his vice president of marketing. She had direct access to his servers. She had helped him route the embezzled money for Patricia through the Bahamas. The federal agents would not just stop at Terrence. They would rip apart his entire executive team. They would seize her bank accounts, audit her digital communications, and drag her right into the federal holding cell next to his. The luxurious, untouchable life she had manipulated her way into was disintegrating before her eyes, replaced by the terrifying, very real specter of an orange jumpsuit. She looked at Terrence, the man she had banked her entire financial and romantic future on. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. He was a rapidly sinking ship, and Jasmine had absolutely no intention of going down with him. The ruthless survival instinct that had driven her to falsify tax returns years ago kicked in with a vengeance. She did the mental math in a fraction of a second and realized she needed a lifeline. "I had nothing to do with the espionage!" Jasmine shouted, her voice shrill and desperate as she backed away from Terrence. She threw her hands up frantically, addressing Nathaniel and the surrounding federal agents. "I am just the marketing director. I did not know he was selling proprietary source code to a foreign entity." Terrence shot her a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. But Jasmine did not care. She was completely frantic, willing to burn the man she supposedly loved to the ground in order to save her own skin. "I have his secondary hard drive," Jasmine screamed to the entire room, offering up the ultimate damning prize to the authorities. "He keeps a hidden encrypted drive in his home office wall safe. It has all his private server logs, his offshore routing numbers, every illegal transaction he has made for the last 3 years. I know the exact combination." She locked eyes with Nathaniel, her expression wild with terrified bargaining. "I will give it to the feds right now. I will testify to everything. I will give you the hard drive for full immunity." The betrayal was the final snapping thread for Terrence. The loss of his money, his freedom, and his pristine reputation had pushed him to the absolute brink, but Jasmine publicly selling him out to the federal government pushed him over the edge into pure violent madness. With a guttural roar of pure rage, Terrence lunged across the floor and violently grabbed Jasmine. His fingers had barely grazed the silk of her collar before the room exploded into motion. Nathaniel did not shout a warning. He did not hesitate. He moved with a terrifying fluid speed, crossing the space between them in a fraction of a second. Nathaniel drove his shoulder directly into Terrence's chest, tackling the disgraced tech CEO to the carpeted floor with a heavy, bone-rattling thud. 2 undercover federal agents who had been posing as catering staff near the Champagne Pyramid instantly abandoned their trays and swarmed the struggling men. Jasmine scrambled backward on her hands and knees, gasping for air, her eyes wide with absolute terror as she watched the man she had planned to marry get pinned to the ground. Terrence thrashed wildly like a feral animal, his expensive velvet suit tearing at the shoulder seam as he desperately tried to throw off the federal agents. He cursed, spitting venom and threats, but his manic energy was completely useless against their trained precision. Within seconds, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. Terrence was hauled roughly to his feet, his arms locked securely behind his back, his pristine corporate image permanently destroyed. Brittany watched the metal cuffs snap shut around her husband's wrists. Her entire universe, every single delusion of grandeur she had fiercely clung to, incinerated in real time. She looked at her father, who was currently being cornered by two agents demanding his passport. She looked at her mother, who was sobbing hysterically against the heavy mahogany doors clutching a federal subpoena. Finally, she looked at Terrence, the man who had bought her a $50,000 fake diamond and promised her a life of unimaginable luxury, now standing as a disgraced handcuffed felon. The weight of her absolute ruin physically crushed her. Brittany's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the floor, completely disregarding the spilled drinks and shattered crystals scattered across the expensive carpet. She did not look at her parents or her husband. She looked directly at me. Brittany scrambled forward on her hands and knees, the restricting fabric of her silver designer gown tearing as she desperately crawled across the floor. She reached out with trembling, perfectly manicured hands and seized the fabric of my dress, gripping it, as if I were the only life raft left in a violently sinking ocean. "Please, Rebecca!" Brittany wailed, her voice, a shrill, hysterical shriek that caused several tech investors to physically recoil in secondhand embarrassment. "You have to stop this. You have to tell them to let him go. We are family. We are sisters. We shared a room together. We grew up together. You cannot do this to me. I am pregnant, Rebecca. I am carrying his child. You cannot send my baby's father to a federal prison." The crowd murmured, a ripple of genuine shock passing through the remaining guests. Playing the pregnancy card was the ultimate desperate manipulation, a calculated attempt to weaponize my own empathy and turn the room against me. Brittany looked up at me, her face a ruined mess of streaked mascara and snot, fully expecting me to instantly cave under the moral weight of an unborn child. She expected the orphaned scapegoat to fold, to put the needs of the golden child above her own justice, exactly as our parents had trained me to do for 2 decades. I looked down at the woman gripping my hem. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, and certainly no familial obligation. I reached down, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her fingers off my dress, pulling the fabric entirely out of her reach. "We shared a room until I was 10. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, ringing out clearly for the entire ballroom to hear. "We shared a room right up until the day Mom moved me down into the unheated, unfinished basement so you could have a custom walk-in closet for your clothes. I spent 8 years freezing through the Boston winters so you could display designer shoes bought with money stolen from my trust fund. Do not dare invoke our childhood to save yourself." Brittany flinched, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the brutal, undeniable reality of her past cruelty was aired out for all of high society to witness. "And you are not pregnant, Brittany," I continued, delivering the final crushing blow with surgical precision. "Do not insult my intelligence. I stood near the bar and watched you drink 3 consecutive glasses of vintage champagne less than an hour ago. You were toasting to your husband's fake corporate merger. You are lying just like you have lied every single day of your pathetic artificial life." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The absolute audacity of faking a pregnancy to avoid federal consequences left the wealthy elite staring at Brittany with undisguised revulsion. She had completely humiliated herself, stripping away the very last shred of her dignity. Across the room, Terrence suddenly stopped struggling against the federal agents. He slowly turned his head, his neck craning to look at the woman crying on the floor. The panic in his eyes was instantly eclipsed by a dark, profound disgust. He had just lost his entire empire, but the realization that his wife had been playing him just as expertly as he had been playing her cut through the chaos. "You lied to me, too!" Terrence snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You told me you were late last week. You told me we were having a family. You used a fake baby to trap me into staying when you found out my startup was bleeding cash. You gold-digging fraud." Brittany's head snapped up, her sorrow instantly transforming into a vicious, cornered rage. She scrambled to her feet, pointing a shaking finger at her handcuffed husband. "I am the fraud!" Brittany screamed, her voice cracking as she unleashed every ounce of her toxic resentment. "You bought me a piece of polished glass and told me it was a $50,000 diamond. You paraded me around the city like a queen while you were secretly meeting your cheap marketing director in hotel rooms. You do not even have a real company, Terrence. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic con artist who is trying to steal from my family." "Your family is broke!" Terrence roared back, struggling against the agents as he lunged toward her, his face purple with fury. "Your mother is a common thief who hired my mistress to launder her stolen money. You have absolutely nothing, Brittany. No money, no status, and no future. We deserve each other." I took a slow step backward, moving to stand safely beside Nathaniel, as the toxic couple fully turned their weapons on one another. They were no longer trying to escape the federal agents or beg for my mercy. They were completely consumed by their own mutual hatred, viciously tearing each other apart in the center of the ruined ballroom, broadcasting their absolute moral bankruptcy to the world. Uniformed police officers flooded through the service doors, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor as they rushed to assist the federal agents. They grabbed Terrence by the shoulders, hauling him off a screaming Jasmine. Terrence kicked and thrashed, his face twisted in an ugly primal rage, but he was completely overpowered. The officers dragged him backward toward the exit, his expensive Italian loafers dragging across the shattered glass and spilled champagne. Jasmine scrambled to her feet, clutching the torn silk of her dress, shouting to Nathaniel that she would retrieve the encrypted hard drive immediately if they promised her written immunity. Brittany remained on the floor, weeping hysterically, completely ignored by the man who had promised her the world, and the mother who had raised her to be a golden child. The attendees watched in absolute silence, completely captivated by the total destruction of the Wilson family's fabricated empire. William watched his son-in-law get physically removed from the premises. He looked at his daughter reduced to a sobbing mess on the floor, and his wife trembling against the wall with a federal subpoena clutched in her hands. The entire foundation of his life was actively incinerating, but the sheer blinding arrogance of a man who had spent 3 decades commanding respect refused to let him surrender completely. He aggressively adjusted his tie, his hands shaking slightly, and stepped forward, attempting to project an aura of unshakable authority. He squared his shoulders, refusing to look at his ruined wife or daughter, and locked his gaze solely on me. "You may have ruined Terrence, but my business will survive," William declared, his voice desperately trying to recapture its usual booming resonance. "I will fight the subpoenas. I will throw every lawyer I have at this federal witch hunt. Patricia's financial crimes are her own, and I will gladly sign the divorce papers to prove my complete lack of involvement. I built a premier logistics firm from the ground up through grit and determination. I survived the dot-com burst. I survived the housing crisis. I will survive this. I still have assets, Rebecca. I still have warehouses, shipping routes, and highly lucrative distribution contracts. You cannot touch my legacy." I did not flinch. I simply shook my head, offering him a look of profound, chilling pity. He was a captain, aggressively barking orders on a ship that was already resting at the bottom of the ocean. "Your company's stock plummeted 40% this morning after rumors of the SEC investigation leaked," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the ballroom. The sudden silence that followed my words was absolute. I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to look me in the eye. I had spent months dissecting his company's financials, waiting for this exact moment. "Your primary lenders called in their debts at 8 o'clock this morning," William the Hearst continued, mercilessly dismantling his false reality. "Your corporate credit lines are entirely frozen. When word got out that your chief operating officer was under federal investigation for wire fraud and your wife was facing embezzlement charges, every major supplier you have halted their shipments. You do not have warehouses or shipping routes anymore. You have liabilities. Your board of directors is currently holding an emergency closed-door vote to completely oust you from the company you claim to have built. William's face turned the color of wet ash. His bravado instantly evaporated. He reached into his jacket pocket with violently trembling fingers and pulled out his smartphone. He swiped frantically, his eyes widening in pure horror as he saw the cascade of missed calls from his board members, his chief financial officer, and his corporate attorneys, the red arrows of his plummeting stock price reflected in his panicked eyes. "No," William stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. "No, that is impossible. I secured a massive bridge loan last quarter. I collateralized the distribution centers to cover our operating costs while we expanded. The holding company promised me a 2-year grace period on the interest. We have a legal contract. They cannot just call in the debt overnight without triggering a massive penalty. I have legal protections." "You took a predatory bridge loan from a faceless holding company because traditional banks refuse to touch your over-leveraged assets," I reminded him, keeping my tone perfectly even. "You were so desperate to keep up the appearance of staggering wealth, so desperate to fund Brittany's lifestyle and cover the massive financial holes Patricia was digging that you never bothered to check who actually owned the holding company buying your debt." William stared at me, his breath hitching. A new terrifying realization began to dawn on his face. He looked frantically at the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom as if suddenly sensing the presence of the final nail in his coffin. The brass handles turned and the heavy doors swung open with a resounding thud. The crowd parted instantly, giving way to the imposing figure stepping into the room. Catherine. My biological mother walked through the doors with the absolute terrifying authority of a billionaire CEO. She was dressed in an immaculate, sharp-tailored suit, her expression carved from pure ice. She was flanked by a terrifying phalanx of ruthlessly efficient corporate lawyers carrying thick leather-bound portfolios. Catherine did not look at the shattered crystal on the floor. She did not look at Patricia crying against the wall or Brittany sobbing on the carpet. She marched directly to the center of the ballroom and locked her piercing gaze solely onto William. The sheer power she radiated made the older man physically shrink back. He had taken advantage of her youth and vulnerability decades ago, helping to strip her of her family's initial logistics business and forcing me into an abusive home to secure his own financial foothold. He thought he had buried her completely. He never anticipated that she would spend the next 30 years building a global empire, waiting patiently in the shadows for the perfect moment to strike. Catherine stopped just a few feet from William. She looked him up and down, taking in his ruined, pathetic state with a look of absolute, unapologetic triumph. "And since Vanguard Logistics holds 80% of your secured debt," Catherine announced, her voice slicing through the silence like a sharpened blade, "I just initiated a hostile takeover. Your business belongs to me now." The final word hung in the vaulted air of the ballroom, ringing with absolute terrifying finality. William's legs simply gave out beneath him. He did not stumble, and he did not try to catch himself. He dropped straight down onto his knees, hitting the patterned carpet with a dull, heavy thud that resonated through the silent crowd. The polished, untouchable titan of industry was instantly gone, replaced by a hollow, broken shell of a man. He stared up at Catherine, his mouth working wordlessly as his brain violently struggled to comprehend the sheer staggering scale of his destruction. He was financially ruined. His life's work, the logistics empire he had built and protected with ruthless aggression, had just been legally ripped from his hands by the very woman he had conspired against decades ago. And waiting for him just outside these heavy ballroom doors was a federal prison cell. The shock paralyzing William quickly mutated into a rabid, desperate fury. He could not attack Catherine. She was shielded by a formidable wall of high-powered corporate attorneys and legally held all of his secured debt. He could not attack me or the armed federal agents securing the perimeter. So, like a wounded, cornered animal turning on its own pack, he spun around on his knees and aimed his absolute hatred directly at his wife. "This is your fault." William snarled, his voice a gravelly, spit-flecked roar as he pointed a trembling finger at Patricia. "Your insatiable greed destroyed us. You could not just live within our means. You had to have the exclusive country club memberships, the extravagant European vacations, the designer home renovations every single year. You embezzled from your own adopted daughter's trust fund to finance a lifestyle we could not afford, and then you dragged my company into your pathetic money laundering scheme to cover your tracks. You dug this grave, Patricia. You killed this family." Patricia pressed herself harder against the velvet-lined wall, weeping uncontrollably as her husband publicly abandoned her to the wolves. Her carefully lifted face was a smeared, horrifying mess of expensive cosmetics and ruined pride. She looked frantically around the room, realizing with crushing certainty that she had absolutely no allies left. The wealthy socialites she had hosted and charmed for years were whispering behind their hands, actively stepping backward and shrinking away from her, as if her financial ruin and impending federal indictment were contagious diseases. With her husband turning on her and the federal agents pulling out their handcuffs, Patricia made a final sickeningly desperate pivot. She looked away from William and locked her tear-filled eyes directly onto Catherine. She pushed herself off the wall, staggering forward a few erratic steps before one of Catherine's imposing corporate lawyers swiftly blocked her path. Patricia ignored the lawyer, clasping her hands together in a twisted, pathetic gesture of begging. She tried to mold her ruined face into an expression of shared maternal struggle, attempting to weaponize the very concept of motherhood against the woman whose child she had stolen and abused for 2 decades. "Catherine, please, you have to understand." Patricia pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic, wavering pitch that bordered on total hysteria. "We are both mothers. I raised her, I changed her diapers, I fed her, and put clothes on her back when she had absolutely no one else. I gave her a roof over her head and ensured she got an education. You owe me for keeping her alive. You owe me for protecting your daughter when you were not there to do it yourself." The absolute audacity of the claim caused a physical ripple of disgust to wash through the room of onlookers. I stood perfectly still, watching my biological mother react to the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Catherine did not shout. She did not lose her temper or raise her voice. Her posture remained impeccably straight, but her eyes darkened into pools of absolute, unforgiving ice. The commanding silence she projected was far more terrifying than William's explosive shouting. "You treated my daughter like an ATM." Catherine stated, her voice dropping to a frigid, lethal register that cut straight to the bone. "You did not raise her, Patricia. You exploited her. You forced her to live in a freezing, unfinished basement while your biological child slept in luxury upstairs. You fed her scraps and dressed her in rags while you drained her inheritance to buy your way into high society." Catherine took a single intimidating step forward, her piercing gaze pinning Patricia in place like a butterfly on a board. "You stole her childhood and you stole my money." Catherine declared, the sheer authority in her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "You owe me $1.5 million, and I promise you I will collect every single penny. I will seize every designer handbag in your closet. I will auction off every piece of diamond jewelry you have ever flaunted. I will liquidate every luxury car sitting in your driveway. I will strip you down to absolutely nothing to get my money back. You will leave this hotel with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you will walk straight into a federal penitentiary." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the absolute certainty of Catherine's financial threat hit her. She collapsed against a nearby cocktail table, sending empty champagne flutes shattering to the floor, completely and utterly broken. While the matriarch and patriarch of the Wilson family disintegrated before the crowd, Brittany remained kneeling on the floor, her mind desperately trying to calculate her own survival. She had just watched her husband Terrence get dragged out of the ballroom in handcuffs, his tech empire revealed as a massive criminal fraud. She had just watched her father lose his multi-million-dollar logistics company in a hostile corporate takeover. She had just heard that her mother's assets were about to be aggressively seized and liquidated by a billionaire CEO to repay a stolen trust fund. The luxurious safety net she had depended on for her entire life had vanished in less than 20 minutes. The fake pregnancy she had attempted to use as a shield to secure my sympathy had been mercilessly exposed. The grand, wealthy illusion of her existence was dead. Brittany slowly pushed herself up from the carpet. Her silver designer gown was ripped at the seams, stained with spilled alcohol and dirt. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting from the federal agents securing the doors to Catherine's relentless lawyers, before finally locking onto me. The malicious arrogance that had defined her entire personality was completely gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic terror. She realized she had absolutely no money, no marketable skills, and no one left to manipulate. She stumbled forward, her hands shaking violently as she stopped just short of my personal space. Her voice was barely a whisper, completely stripped of its usual venom. "Where am I supposed to live?" Brittany whimpered, her chest heaving as the reality of her destitution finally set in. Terrence's penthouse was rented. I looked down at her tear-streaked face, completely devoid of its usual arrogant sneer. The absolute desperation in her voice was a symphony composed of her own terrible life choices. For years, she had paraded around in designer clothes, bought with my stolen inheritance, mocking my existence, while secure in the belief that her wealth was an impenetrable fortress. Now she was kneeling on a ruined carpet, begging the sister she had relentlessly abused for a scrap of mercy. The ballroom was dead silent, save for the heavy breathing of the disgraced tech CEO being dragged down the service hallway and the muffled, pathetic sobs of Patricia Wilson crumpled against the far wall. Catherine stood a few feet away, surrounded by her lethal team of corporate attorneys. She did not intervene. She simply watched me with a look of profound, quiet pride, allowing me to deliver the final strike myself. I reached into my slim leather briefcase, my movements slow and deliberate. I wanted Brittany to feel every agonizing second of suspense. I wanted the entire ballroom, the wealthy elite who had blindly celebrated this toxic family, to witness the precise moment the Wilson dynasty was formally eradicated. I pulled out a crisp, officially stamped document and held it up so the harsh ballroom lighting caught the stark red lettering at the top. "About that penthouse," I said, keeping my voice conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than her total destitution. "It turns out living the high life on stolen funds eventually catches up with you. Terrence has not paid the rent on that luxury property in 4 months." Brittany stared at the paper, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. She shook her head, strands of perfectly styled hair sticking to her wet cheeks. Her mouth opened, but only a pathetic raspy sound emerged. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land, completely incapable of processing the words I was speaking. "Your husband was floating his lifestyle on a series of predatory loans and empty promises," I explained, watching the last vestiges of her hope drain away. "He used the penthouse as a prop to lure in naive investors, but he never actually owned it. The property management company filed the paperwork weeks ago when his checks started bouncing across the city. The eviction notice was officially processed and approved by a judge yesterday afternoon. By the time you find a ride back to that building tonight, the locks will already be changed, and your expensive designer luggage will be sitting in cardboard boxes on the sidewalk. You have absolutely no legal right to step foot inside that building ever again." Brittany began to hyperventilate. Her breaths came in short, jagged gasps, her chest heaving violently under the torn silver fabric of her gown. She clutched her throat, her carefully constructed world shrinking down to the size of a cold prison cell. She frantically looked toward her mother, who was still slumped against the cocktail table weeping, and then toward her father, who was staring blankly at the floor, utterly defeated by Catherine and her army of corporate lawyers. The gears in Brittany's mind ground together, desperately searching for a safety net that no longer existed. "I will go home!" Brittany choked out, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "I will go back to Mom and Dad's house, the estate in the hills. They mortgaged it to help Terrence, but it is still ours. It has 6 bedrooms. I can live there. I will live in my old room. We can regroup. We can figure this out. We just need time to get the lawyers involved." She was clinging to the bricks of a crumbling mansion, entirely unaware that the foundation had already been completely pulverized. She honestly believed that the sprawling gated estate where they had treated me like a stray dog would always be there to shelter her from the consequences of her own actions. She thought her parents could magically absorb her failure just as they had always done. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stepped forward and handed the stamped document directly into her shaking hands. She looked down at it, her tear-blurred eyes struggling to focus on the dense legal jargon and the undeniable embossed seal of the county clerk. Her hands trembled so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. "You cannot go back to that house, Brittany," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute clinical finality. When Patricia illegally siphoned money from my trust fund to cover her embezzlement tracks, she also took out a massive, highly illegal second mortgage on the family estate to keep Terrence's failing tech company afloat. She was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and she completely ran out of cash. Brittany stared at the document, finally recognizing it for what it was. A notice of foreclosure. The final nail in the coffin of her privileged existence. She defaulted on that illegal mortgage 3 months ago. I continued, ensuring every single word landed with maximum devastating impact. The bank foreclosed on the property. They put it up for a private expedited auction. And because I had been monitoring your family's spectacular financial implosion for the better part of a year, I was the highest bidder. I bought the estate this morning. It legally belongs to me now. The crowd in the ballroom let out a collective hushed murmur. William raised his heavy head, his eyes widening in fresh horror as he realized his home, his ultimate symbol of status and wealth, had been bought out from under him by the daughter he had thrown away. Patricia let out a loud wail, burying her face in her hands. Brittany let out a wounded, suffocating gasp. She tried to shove the paper back at me as if rejecting the physical document could somehow reverse the legal reality of her situation. "You cannot do this," she sobbed, rocking back and forth on her heels. "That is our home. That is where I grew up. You cannot take my home." I did not step back. I leaned in slightly, locking my eyes onto hers, letting her see the unbreakable resolve that had fueled me for the past 5 years. "I am not keeping it," I whispered, though my voice carried easily across the silent room, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and velvet walls. "I am having the entire estate bulldozed next week." Brittany froze, her sobbing instantly cutting off as shock paralyzed her vocal cords. "I am tearing down every single wall, every imported marble floor, and every custom closet," I declared, my voice echoing with righteous authority. "I am clearing the lot completely to build a state-of-the-art community center for foster kids. The home where you made me feel like an unwanted burden, the house where you laughed while I froze in the basement, is going to be a sanctuary for children who actually need a safe place to sleep. You have absolutely nothing left, Brittany. Your fake empire is gone." Brittany let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of her new reality. The luxurious safety net she had depended on her entire life had been completely pulverized, replaced by the crushing weight of total destitution. She slumped onto the carpet, burying her face in her hands as the final remnants of her fake empire dissolved into dust. Her designer gown, the stolen wealth, the fabricated prestige, all of it was gone. I stepped past her, completely indifferent to her theatrical sobbing, and turned my attention to the center of the room. The absolute destruction of the Wilson family was now complete. The ballroom, once a glittering symbol of their fabricated wealth and untouchable status, had fully transformed into a chaotic staging ground for federal law enforcement. Uniformed officers and plainclothes agents moved with clinical, devastating efficiency, systematically dismantling the corrupt hierarchy that had controlled my life for decades. Terrence was currently being hauled to his feet by 2 massive security guards. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists clinked sharply as he violently twisted his body, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not looking at me or the federal agents. He was glaring directly at Jasmine, who was currently being cornered against the champagne fountain by an FBI operative. You parasitic traitor, Terrence screamed, his voice raw and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You think giving them my hard drive is going to save you? You routed the offshore accounts. Your signature is on every single wire transfer to the Caymans. You are going down right next to me. You pathetic fraud. Jasmine did not fire back with her usual sharp tongue. Her pristine marketing executive persona had completely shattered. A female agent firmly grasped her arms, snapping a pair of heavy zip ties around her wrists. Jasmine sobbed, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, as she frantically babbled about plea deals and corporate immunity to an agent who was completely ignoring her. She was swiftly marched toward the service exit, her designer heels dragging across the floor, her glamorous life reduced to a cautionary tale of corporate greed. Across the room, Nathaniel signaled to his lead agents. They moved in perfect unison, flanking Patricia and William. William stood frozen, his eyes glazed over the reality of Catherine's hostile takeover, having completely short-circuited his brain. The titan of the logistics industry was gone. He offered absolutely no resistance as an agent firmly gripped his arm and turned him around, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. Catherine watched him from across the room, her expression devoid of pity, a silent testament to a vengeance 30 years in the making. Patricia, however, was not going quietly. The sheer terror of her impending incarceration caused her to physically lash out. She swatted at the federal agent reaching for her wrist, her heavy diamond bracelets clattering together in a frantic metallic rhythm. "Get your hands off me!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with wild desperation. "I am a prominent member of this community. I serve on charity boards. You cannot treat me like a common criminal. I demand to speak to my lawyer immediately." William and Patricia Wilson. Nathaniel declared, his voice cutting through her hysterics with commanding, icy authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The recitation of the Miranda rights hit Patricia like a physical blow. The clinical, rhythmic words stripped away her country club membership, her charity board positions, and her stolen wealth, reducing her to exactly what she was, a desperate, cornered felon. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy investors and socialites who were watching her downfall with morbid fascination. People she had dined with, gossiped with, and manipulated for years were now actively turning their backs, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of the Wilson family. Realizing she had absolutely no allies left, she turned her venom entirely on me. Patricia lunged forward, straining against the heavy grip of the federal agent holding her arm. Her perfectly lifted face twisted into a mask of pure venomous hatred. "You are a monster!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the ballroom. "How can you be so cold? We gave you a home. We fed you. We clothed you when you had absolutely nothing. How can you stand there and do this to the people who took you in? You ungrateful, vicious little snake." I did not flinch. I did not back away or lower my gaze. I stepped directly into her personal space, forcing her to look me in the eyes. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was low enough for only her and the arresting agents to hear, but laced with enough venom to freeze her blood. "You told me on my 23rd birthday that I was no longer useful to your public image. I stated my words precise and merciless. You stood in the kitchen of the house I now own, looked me in the eye, and told me I was a bad investment because I refused to marry the abusive trust fund kid you picked out for me to secure your own social standing. You told me to pack my bags and disappear because my independence was an embarrassment to your high society friends." Patricia's jaw trembled, the color completely draining from her face as her own cruel words were weaponized and fired back at her. The righteous indignation vanished, replaced by the crushing realization that her own cruelty had engineered her absolute downfall. "I am just returning the favor," I whispered, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You have absolutely no value to me anymore, Patricia. Your money is gone. Your reputation is dead. Your family is entirely destroyed. Enjoy federal prison." I stepped back, signaling to Nathaniel. The agents immediately pulled Patricia backward, her legs giving out as they practically dragged her toward the heavy double doors. William followed silently, his head bowed, a completely defeated man walking to his own funeral. As the officers shoved Terrence toward the main exit, he dug his heels into the carpet, fighting their grip one last time. He violently twisted his neck, locking his manic, bloodshot eyes on me. His corporate facade was dead, replaced by the feral desperation of a cornered rat realizing his cage had finally been permanently sealed. "This is not over, Rebecca!" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with unhinged fury as the officers forced him through the doorway. "You think locking me up ends this? My guys on the outside will ruin your firm. I have your client list. I will burn your whole life to the ground." I followed the procession out of the ballroom, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut behind me as the chaos spilled into the grand foyer of the hotel and out toward the main valet entrance. The cool, crisp night air rushed in, mixing with the sharp glare of red and blue emergency lights that bounced aggressively off the hotel's towering glass facade. The entire portico had been completely commandeered by federal law enforcement. Armored SUVs and marked police cruisers formed an impenetrable barricade, their radios crackling with harsh staccato dispatch codes. Terrence was being shoved roughly against the side of a black cruiser. An officer firmly patted him down, emptying his pockets of luxury car keys, a platinum money clip, and a burner phone. Terrence continued to thrash, fighting the undeniable reality of his arrest. He stretched his neck, searching the crowd of onlookers gathered on the steps until he spotted me walking calmly down the marble stairs. "You think you won, Rebecca?" Terrence screamed, his voice strained and grating. He was spitting his words, his face purple with exertion. "You think you are the smartest person in the room because you brought the FBI to a dinner party. You have absolutely no idea what you just triggered. I have a dead man's switch. If I do not manually enter my security override by midnight, my servers will automatically dump your entire client list to the dark web. I will expose every single trade secret Vanguard Logistics has. I will sink Catherine's stock by morning. You are going down with me." I stopped just a few feet away from him. The flashing emergency lights illuminated his face, highlighting the beads of nervous sweat rolling down his forehead. He was desperate, violently clinging to the illusion that he still held a master key to his survival. He truly believed he was a tech genius, a mastermind who had built an empire so complex that not even the federal government could dismantle it. I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us. Then a genuine, completely unforced laugh escaped my lips. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed clearly over the noise of the idling engines and the crackling police radios. Terrence flinched, his manic, ranting stuttering to an abrupt halt. The pure confidence in my laughter rattled him more than the handcuffs binding his wrists. "You are incredibly predictable, Terrence," I said, reaching into my tailored jacket. "You built an entire career on stealing other people's work, taking credit for their innovations, and hiding behind offshore proxies. You really thought I would spend months dissecting your fraudulent company and forget to look into your contingency plans." I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and turned the brightness all the way up. I took a deliberate step forward, holding the glowing screen right in front of his face, so he had absolutely no choice but to read it. "Your guys on the outside," I stated, quoting his desperate threat back to him. "You are referring to Marcus and Leo, correct? The two hackers you have been paying under the table to run your shadow servers out of an abandoned commercial warehouse in Delaware." Terrence stopped breathing. His eyes locked onto the screen of my phone. Displayed in high definition was a live video feed from Nathaniel's cyber division. It showed the inside of the Delaware warehouse completely flooded with tactical agents. Racks of glowing servers were being systematically dismantled, unplugged, and loaded into secure federal transport cases. "How did you—" Terrence choked out, his voice instantly dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. "Nathaniel's team raided the warehouse exactly 1 hour before this gala even started." I explained, my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing quarterly earnings. "We have been monitoring their encrypted communications for 6 months. When the federal agents kicked the doors in, your highly loyal, untouchable guys did exactly what cowards always do when faced with a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. They folded immediately. I swiped the screen, bringing up a digital copy of a signed legal document. They accepted a federal plea deal. I continued watching the last remaining spark of arrogance die in his eyes. They handed over the physical servers, the master decryption keys, the offshore account routing numbers, and the entire client list exactly 10 minutes ago. Your dead man's switch was deactivated before you even finished your first glass of champagne tonight. You have absolutely no leverage, Terrence. You have no contingency plan. You are just a fraud wearing an expensive suit. The realization hit Terrence with the force of a freight train. He had spent his entire life believing he was 10 steps ahead of everyone else, manipulating his way to the top, only to realize I had completely mapped out his destruction before he even knew we were playing a game. His knees buckled, his legs giving out completely as the crushing weight of his absolute failure finally broke his spirit. The officers had to physically hold him up to prevent him from collapsing onto the wet asphalt. He did not scream anymore. He did not threaten me or curse Jasmine or beg for a lawyer. He just stared at the pavement, his chest heaving with silent, ragged sobs, as the officers pushed his head down and shoved him into the back of the police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a resounding final thud. The engine roared to life, and the cruiser pulled away from the curb, joining the convoy of federal vehicles carrying William, Patricia, and Jasmine to holding cells. I watched the red lights fade into the distance, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the night air. The toxic, suffocating presence of the Wilson family had finally been eradicated from my life. I turned around to head back inside, but a slight movement by the hotel entrance caught my eye. Brittany was standing alone on the sidewalk, entirely forgotten by the exiting guests and the remaining valet staff. Her silver designer gown was ruined, the expensive fabric torn and stained. The cool night wind whipped around her, making her violently shiver, but she did not move to go inside. She just stood there, staring blankly at the empty street where her parents and her husband had just been carted away. Her hands were clasped tightly around her neck, desperately clutching the massive, glittering pendant Terrence had given her for their anniversary. It was supposed to be a flawless 5-carat diamond, the ultimate symbol of her superiority. But the federal agents who seized Patricia's real jewelry upstairs had completely ignored Brittany's necklace, openly mocking her by confirming it was nothing but cheap, worthless cubic zirconia bought with a maxed-out credit card. She stood utterly broken in the aftermath of her own destruction, her fake jewelry shining under the flashing emergency lights. She slowly turned her head and looked at me, her eyes wide, hollow, and pathetic, waiting in absolute silence for a final word of pity. The cold autumn wind whipped down the city street, carrying the sharp scent of exhaust and incoming rain. Brittany shivered violently, her bare shoulders exposed to the elements, her fake cubic zirconia pendant feeling like a heavy, worthless chain around her neck. For a long, agonizing minute, she just stared at me. The flashing red and blue lights from the remaining police cruisers painted her pale face in harsh, unforgiving strokes. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the conditioned, obedient foster sister to rush forward, wrap a warm coat around her trembling shoulders, and promise that everything would be all right. She was waiting for the emotional bailout she had relied on her entire life to fix a situation she could no longer control. But the woman standing before her was not the frightened girl they had locked in a freezing basement. I remained perfectly still, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute indifference. Her lower lip trembled, the last ounce of her false superiority bleeding out onto the wet pavement. She squeezed the fake diamond so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "What am I supposed to do now?" Rebecca Brittany asked, her voice small, fragile, and utterly devoid of its usual piercing arrogance. The question hung in the damp air, a pathetic echo of a life completely unraveled. She genuinely expected an instruction manual for surviving the disaster she had actively helped create. She wanted me to give her a lifeline, a contact, a hidden bank account, anything to shield her from the impending freefall. I looked at the sister who had systematically bullied, demeaned, and tormented me for 2 decades. I looked at the woman who had flaunted stolen wealth while actively trying to destroy my career and my marriage simply out of petty jealousy. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, and certainly no pity. "You have a degree you never used." "And two hands," I replied, my voice carrying the crisp, sharp edge of a shattered glacier. "I suggest you start filling out job applications. Welcome to the real world, Brittany." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She flinched, her breath hitching as the reality of my statement sank into her privileged brain. For her entire adult life, she had viewed labor as something beneath her, a vulgar necessity reserved for the people she tipped poorly at luxury resorts. Now she was staring down the barrel of a minimum wage existence burdened by the crushing infamy of her family's highly publicized federal indictment. Her last name, once a golden ticket in this city, was now a toxic brand. No country club friend would take her calls. No high society boutique would hire the disgraced daughter of a convicted embezzler. There would be no more spa days funded by stolen trust money. There would be no more penthouse suites or private chefs. There would only be the relentless grinding reality of earning her own survival dollar by grueling dollar. She opened her mouth, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks, preparing to launch into a desperate pleading negotiation. She took a step toward me, reaching out a shaking hand to grab my sleeve. Before a single syllable could escape her lips, I turned my back on her. The movement was swift, deliberate, and agonizingly final. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not pause to listen to her sharp intake of breath. I simply walked away. As my heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, a vivid memory flashed through my mind, perfectly mirroring this exact physical motion. I was 19 years old, standing in the cold marble foyer of the estate I now legally owned. I had been holding a stack of past-due tuition bills, practically begging Brittany for a small loan from her exorbitant allowance, just to keep my college enrollment active so I would not lose my scholarships. She had been wearing a brand new silk robe, sipping an espresso she forced me to make for her. She had looked at my desperate, tear-streaked face, let out a short, dismissive laugh, and simply turned her back on me. She had walked away without a single word of comfort, her fluffy slippers sliding against the marble, leaving me standing there drowning in panic, completely indifferent to my survival. Tonight, the universe had delivered a perfect symmetrical poetry. I was returning the exact gesture she had perfected. The sound of her frantic, breathless sobbing faded into the background noise of the city traffic. I crossed the police perimeter, ducking under the yellow caution tape, and walked straight toward the two figures waiting for me near the hotel entrance. Catherine stood tall and immaculate in her tailored suit, the billionaire CEO radiating an aura of unshakable power and calm authority. Nathaniel stood right beside her, his federal badge gleaming against his dark jacket, his posture relaxed but fiercely protective. As I approached them, the visual contrast hit me with staggering, breathtaking clarity. Behind me, left in the dust, the cold and the flashing sirens, was the broken, toxic illusion of the Wilson family. They were a syndicate of greed and manipulation, a group of miserable people currently being processed into the federal penal system and left to rot on the sidewalk. They had spent years trying to break me to make themselves feel whole, and in the end they had only managed to annihilate themselves. Ahead of me, standing firmly in the light, was my true family. A family built not on stolen wealth or fabricated prestige, but on loyalty, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. I stepped up to my biological mother and the man who had fought relentlessly by my side to dismantle a criminal empire. Catherine reached out her strong hand, grasping mine in a gesture of profound, undeniable solidarity. Her grip was warm and fierce, silently communicating decades of lost time that we were finally going to reclaim. Nathaniel smiled, a genuine expression of pride and triumph that made my chest tighten with a profound sense of peace. We did not need to say a single word. The long, dark chapter of my stolen life was permanently closed, and our new untouchable empire was just beginning. 3 weeks later, The morning sun poured through the flawless floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office on the 50th floor of the Vanguard building. The city of Boston sprawled beneath me, a glittering grid of steel and glass, completely oblivious to the massive power shift that had just fractured its financial elite. My sanctuary was a study in absolute control. There were no gaudy chandeliers, no fake gold accents, no desperate attempts to project wealth. Instead, the space was defined by sharp lines, polished black walnut, and the quiet, steady hum of genuine power. I sat behind my desk reviewing the latest quarterly projections for my firm, feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. The heavy glass door swung open, and Nathaniel walked in. He moved with the relaxed, effortless confidence of a man who had just successfully executed the biggest takedown of his career. He dropped a thick, heavily redacted manila folder right onto the center of my desk. He did not bother with formalities, simply pulling out a leather chair and sitting across from me with a highly satisfied smirk. "The federal indictments were officially unsealed this morning," Nathaniel announced, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I thought you might want the final damage report before the press conference at noon." I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. "Tell me everything." "William and Patricia are completely ruined," Nathaniel stated, his voice laced with clinical precision. Their defense attorneys argued for house arrest, citing their ties to the community and their supposedly fragile health. The judge took one look at the sheer volume of offshore wire transfers Jasmine authorized and immediately classified them as an extreme flight risk. Bail was unconditionally denied. They are going to rot in federal holding until the trial, and the Asset Forfeiture Division has already seized the Beacon Hill estate, the luxury cars, and the remaining bank accounts. They do not have a single dime left to their names. I nodded, picturing Patricia sitting in a cold concrete cell, stripped of her designer clothes and her country club status, forced to face the reality of the miserable existence she had engineered for herself. "And Terrence?" I asked. Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Terrence actually thought he could negotiate. He tried to offer the prosecution a deal, promising to hand over his shadow network of shell companies in exchange for a reduced sentence. He did not realize that the hard drives we seized in Delaware already gave us everything we needed." The U.S. attorney literally laughed him out of the room. "He is facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. No parole, no white-collar resort prison. Hard time." "That just leaves Brittany," I said, leaning back in my chair. Nathaniel's smile widened into a full grin. "You are going to love this part." One of my junior agents was grabbing breakfast on his way to the field office this morning. He pulled into a fast food drive-thru a few towns over. Guess who handed him his coffee and hash browns? I raised an eyebrow, the image instantly materializing in my mind. "Brittany Wilson." Nathaniel confirmed, his tone practically singing with amusement. Wearing a grease-stained polyester uniform, a plastic name tag, and a headset. The agent said she looked like she had not slept in days. She messed up his change twice, and the shift manager yelled at her right in front of him. "She has absolutely nothing left, Rebecca. She is working minimum wage just to afford a cheap weekly motel room. Welcome to the real world indeed." Before I could fully process the absolute poetic justice of Brittany's new reality, the office door opened again. Catherine stepped inside, carrying 2 steaming cups of artisanal dark roast coffee. She wore a striking, impeccably tailored crimson suit, looking every bit the triumphant billionaire who had just reclaimed her stolen legacy. She handed a cup to Nathaniel with a gracious nod, then walked around the desk to hand me mine. She did not take a seat. Instead, Catherine moved to the massive glass window looking out over the sprawling skyline. The morning light caught her features, highlighting the strong, undeniable biological resemblance between us. I stood up and joined her, the warm coffee mug grounding me in the present moment. We stood shoulder to shoulder, a united, unbreakable family, looking down at the empire we had reclaimed together. "You didn't just survive them, Rebecca," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying a weight of immense pride and profound understanding. "You conquered them." I took a sip of the bitter, rich coffee, letting her words wash over me. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, casting my mind back exactly 10 years. I remembered being 23 years old, standing on the freezing pavement outside that upscale restaurant. I remembered the crushing, suffocating terror of Patricia throwing me out like garbage, the sheer panic of having absolutely no money, no home, and no safety net. I remembered the hollow, aching belief that I was fundamentally flawed, a disposable charity case who would never amount to anything. I opened my eyes, bringing myself back to the 33-year-old Titan, standing in a corner office that bore my name. The transformation was absolute. I realized in that quiet, sunlit moment that true revenge was never simply about taking their money or throwing them in prison. The Wilson family had spent my entire life writing a false narrative about who I was. They had cast themselves as the benevolent saviors and me as the pathetic, ungrateful burden. True revenge was burning their entire story to the ground. It was violently stripping away their fake prestige to expose the rotting, corrupt core of their existence. It was proving undeniably and absolutely my own immense worth. They had tried to bury me completely unaware that I was a seed. Nathaniel stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. I have to get back to the field office to prepare the press briefing. Enjoy the victory, Rebecca. You earned every single piece of it. Thank you, Nathaniel, I replied, offering him a genuine warm smile. For everything. He gave a crisp nod and walked out, leaving Catherine and me in the quiet sanctuary of the office. Catherine squeezed my shoulder affectionately before heading toward the door to prepare for her own board meeting. I walked back to my mahogany desk and sat down. The Wilson chapter was permanently closed. Their toxic legacy was eradicated, completely scrubbed from the financial landscape. I reached across the polished wood and pulled a fresh, unopened manila case file toward me. It was a preliminary dossier Nathaniel had dropped off yesterday regarding a corrupt pharmaceutical conglomerate actively defrauding public health programs. I traced my finger over the edge of the folder. A new target, a new empire of lies waiting to be dismantled. I smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that promised absolute destruction for anyone who dared to cross my path. I flipped the heavy cover open, picked up my favorite silver pen, and got to work. Fade to black.